Jenkinson kept the wishbones he found in chickens and other birds hooked up on nails and along various ledges and shelves in the kitchen. They were all sizes and all ages. Some, fringed with withered and stinking brown skin, dated from years back, and looked as though they might have been dug up out of some ancient mass chicken grave. There were others smooth and yellow as fragments of ivory, and always one or two brand-new ones still stuck with tasty pieces of white flesh. Yet Jenkinson would have it believed there was no particular meaning to his collection. He referred to them as bones, never as wishbones. From the cool way he dealt with unwelcome questions, he might have been an anatomist keeping the secrets of his trade from ignorant minds. Occasionally, someone would try to humour Jenkinson out of his obsession. "Look here, Jenkinson, aren't you ever going to use those wishbones?" "Use?" he'd say. "How do you mean, use?" "Well, I mean, what exactly are you keeping them for? They're wishbones, aren't they? For wishing with." For a moment Jenkinson would look incredulous, then smile slowly, rubbing his chin in contemptuous amusement. He would say nothing. Nothing more would be said about bones of any description. Sometimes Jenkinson would lift up his head and study the round, red faces of his 4 children, his wife, and his wife's mother with amazement. They seemed to him to be without a care in the world. He himself was tall, round-shouldered, and very thin, with long, nervous arms and twitching fingers. His black eyes were set rather closely together in their deep sockets, giving him a suspicious and at times a somewhat miserly appearance. But it was only wishes he was miserly with, wishes which he had hoarded and kept to himself throughout the years. They had piled up more thickly, however, in the shape of bones, from the time when he had begun to leave his business, a thriving hardware shop, more and more in the capable hands of his wife and his married son. A close study of the Jenkinsons' kitchen would have given most people the feeling that this family had eaten nothing but fowls since the time they'd moved in. Yet their eating habits were no different from the average family. They had the usual steaks, stews, fries and hash, a chicken every fortnight or so, a turkey at Christmas and for the occasional celebration. But on the chicken days, there was an unmistakable tension at table. Oddly enough, Jenkinson did not carve himself, and never insisted on this. His wife carved, and as she wielded the knife and flicked pieces onto the 7 plates, Jenkinson's eyes would dart suspiciously from dish to dish. If he found the precious bone himself, he would pick it up and put it on one side, but his face would remain expressionless. Occasionally he would look wearily resigned, and even slightly grim, as he handled the object, as though the weight of adding yet another to his pile of unused and yellowing desires was beginning to be more than he could stand. Long ago, when his collection was quite small, and still had a whiteness and a gleam to it, Jenkinson had suffered an immense shock when informed by some killjoy that these bones had no potency unless their snapping was shared by some other person. Up till that time he had kept himself going when all else failed, with a vision of himself on some dark night working his way out from under the stuffy quilt of the double bed, stamped with garlands resembling funeral wreaths, kicking his way silently through the horrible conglomeration of old shoes which seemed to work their way out from under the bed at night like rooting animals of the dark, out into the faintly snoring passage and down the stairs. There, alone in the kitchen over a fragile heap of gleaming bones, he would snap off his wishes one by one with his own bare hands. There was a terrifying, unimpeded bareness about the whole scene, which he had known all along in his heart of hearts was too good to be true. When he was enlightened about his bones, realizing that human beings had caught up with him again and might actually try to take a hand in the business, the zest for collecting became even more fanatical. Only over his dead body would he let those nearest to him snap his bones. For nowadays he could imagine no wish which might come from him, however secretly, which would not automatically be annihilated by its dead opposite flying from his wife. As for his children, they were not the wishing kind. This was how things stood, and how they would likely have gone on, if it had not been for a chance meeting Jenkinson had from his own kitchen with a window cleaner who had been working on the office windows next to their own. The Jenkinsons lived 3 stories up, and a narrow balcony with iron railings joined the 2 windows. It was 11 o'clock in the morning. Jenkinson had been standing at the sink staring out, and the window cleaner was squatting on the balcony with a couple of cloths slung over his shoulder, smoking a mid-morning cigarette. He had just got to his feet, and before starting in again had swung himself sideways to take a quick look into the neighbouring window. He was not put off by the morose figure standing inside, but the fine bone drapery around the sink and along the shelves obviously shook him. He pressed his face close to the glass, and steadied himself with his hand on the inside sill of the window, which was open at the bottom. "That little lot there must add up to quite a fair number of fowls, if you don't mind my saying so. Do you never eat anything but chickens around here?" "We eat the same as everyone eats, the normal diet, same as you eat yourself," said Jenkinson threateningly. But he had pushed the window up as far as it would go, and the window cleaner was now sitting on the outside sill with no glass between them. He had taken a cloth from his shoulder and was folding it contemplatively into a square. "Your idea to string 'em all up, then?" he asked. Jenkinson glowered and bunched his shoulders. "Because if it was, you've shown more sense than some," said the other man soothingly. He had now put one leg over the sill. "I mean, why shouldn't you save them all for a rainy day and blow the whole lot together? Get your money's worth out of it. Not that stingy cheese-paring, one here and one there sort of style some people go for. Blow 'em all sky-high. Lord, what a blasted bright, lucky crack-up there's going to be one day." "Crack-up," repeated Jenkinson warily, keeping his eyes fixed on the man's face. "That's right. One after the other. Snap, snap, snap. And the wishies whooshing off like rockets. Boy, what a blast-off." "It takes 2, said Jenkinson dourly. The other put his head inside and took a good look round the kitchen, listening for sounds from other rooms, then said, lowering his voice, "You're telling me it takes 2. Haven't they got it all arranged now so there's hardly a thing left you can do on your own? It's like that everywhere you turn these days, blocked, all along the line." He cocked his thumb sideways. "Isn't she willing to take a snap at 'em?" "I never asked her," said Jenkinson. "How about the family?" "They get what they want," said Jenkinson. "They don't need bones." The window cleaner nodded slowly and brooded for a while. "How about you and me, finishing them off?" he said at last. "Finishing them off?" repeated Jenkinson, looking round him with dull eyes. He was still thinking of his family. "Sure, we could bust the whole lot at one go. I'm telling you, those wishbones are going to go stale on you if you keep them strung up there much longer." "Wishbones," exclaimed Jenkinson, but the scorn was half-hearted. This outsider was here either to wreck the old order of things or to deliver him for ever from his bony shackles. Nevertheless, for a long moment he was silent. Jenkinson said out of the unplumbed, grudging depths within him, "Right. You can come in." "I won't come in, thanks all the same," said the window cleaner, quietly stubbing out his cigarette. A polite formality had established itself between them in the last minutes, as between 2 persons on the point of a grave decision. This made it easier for Jenkinson, who had begun to gather up the bones from around the place, picking them off their hooks and knobs and putting them into a large pudding basin. The oldest ones made a dry, rustling sound as they were brushed from the high ledges where they had lain for years. But none of them got broken. At last he came over to the window, holding the bowl in both hands. "Is that the lot?" said the window cleaner sharply, leaning in as far as he could go. Jenkinson was unnerved. He walked slowly towards a cupboard, opened it, and plunged his hand down into a pair of old Wellington boots, and brought out 6 more bones, which he took over and dropped reluctantly, one by one, into the bowl. "That's more like it," said the other man. "Are you ready, then?" Jenkinson gave him a look. He had been ready for years. Long before this young man was born, he'd been ready. Slowly he picked out a bone and held it up. "Not that way!" cried the window cleaner irritably. "Do you want to mess up the whole thing? Like this." He inserted his little finger into the hoop and motioned Jenkinson to take the other side. When the first bone snapped, Jenkinson started as though he had been shot, and at the second, as though some vital part had given way inside him. For a long time he went on twitching, starting and jerking, but when they had got a quarter way through the bowl, he had settled down a bit, except that now and then he winced, and his lips moved slowly as he bent over the dwindling bones. The window cleaner allowed no time to elapse between the snapping. He was in a hurry now, but his face remained impassive, as systematically he flung bits of broken bone over his shoulder down into the backyards below. They worked in silence. Jenkinson's wishes were forced from him under fearful concentration, and they hung so heavily over him that the air within the four walls of the kitchen seemed to grow every minute more dense. The window cleaner's wishes flew casually from him into the air. They were obviously light things which he forgot as soon as they left his mind. At last the pudding basin was empty. "That's you now," cried the window cleaner gleefully, drawing his foot back over the ledge and crouching on the outside sill. He appeared to be suspended between earth and sky without a care in the world. There was nothing more for him to say. He began to move sideways, still stooping, the cloths flapping from his shoulder, and he was out of sight. Jenkinson never saw him again, and never wished to see him. The window cleaner had done his job thoroughly. He had delivered him from a pile of bones which had been going sour on him, and at the same time killed in him any desire ever to make such a collection again. As for Jenkinson himself, it would have been odd if some sort of change had not showed itself in a man who had got through a great basinful of wishes which had taken him a lifetime to think up. Some people might have expected a little luck to show on him, even if it was simply a fishy shine that would make him faintly visible in the dark. Even those with no superstition in their make-up might have expected him to brace himself in some all-out effort to ensure that at least one or two of these wishes came true, even if he had to work himself to the bone for it. But nothing of the kind happened. Almost overnight, Jenkinson had given up all idea of luck or anything else. He became a loose, dangling sort of fellow with an aimless gape to the jaw, and a peculiar limpness which extended through all his joints from his flaccid fingers right down into his shambling feet. Family meals were no ordeal now. In fact, the lessening of tension around the house and the complete absence of his former spites and suspicions would have made him an almost amiable chap to be with if only he could have brought himself to show the slightest spark of interest in anyone or anything. As it was, most people find it almost impossible to make contact with a man who in fact looked and acted as though every single bone in his body, big or little, had been cleanly and systematically snapped in two.